In 1893, Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, a World's Fair which gave us the Ferris Wheel, moving walkways, spray paint, movie theaters, nighttime football games, and maybe one day, a movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio as a murderous serial-killing hotel owner. One day. It was also probably one of the best attempts at utopia the world has ever seen. Welcome to Finding Utopia. So Chicago brought out all the stops to make the 1893 World's Fair a reality. But perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit. First off, how did Chicago even end up with the World's Fair? Well, you see, the first American World's Fair was actually held in Philadelphia in 1876. People showed up to it for sure, but they must not have been people with money because financially the fair was a failure. Nevertheless, as Americans tend to do, we decided to just forget about the fair, pretend it never happened, and try again. This time, around the celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus crossing the ocean blue. The fair was a hot commodity. St. Louis had a utopia. Chicago had a utopia. New York City also had a utopia that we just haven't made a video for yet. And Washington, D.C., definitely not a utopia. All expressed interest in hosting the World's Fair. In order to decide which city would win the bid, Congress held a fight club.
The first rule of Fight Club is, you do not talk about Fight Club.
Well, actually, Congress got together to hear proposals from each city, but it was kind of like a metaphorical fight club. New York, in typical New York fashion, brought out all the stops. I'm talking J.P. Morgan, I'm talking Cornelius Vanderbilt, I'm talking the notorious B.I.G. himself. Oh no, wait, he wasn't there. But William Waldorf Astoria was. And for Chicago, their fighters included
Choose your character.
Charles T. Yerkes, Marshall Field, Philip Armoire, Gustavus Swift, Cyrus McCormick. The race was so close, not even Frank Sinatra would have been able to choose between the two cities. That's a joke about him having two great songs about both cities, but I don't think that lands with the current viewership demographics on this channel. But one Senate hearing in 1890 changed everything, when a representative named Thomas Barber Bryant argued that the most important qualities for a World's Fair were abundant supplies of good air and pure water, which obviously ruled out New York. So with that settled, it came time to plan and build the fair. The fair was to cover 690 acres in Chicago's Jackson Park and Midway Pleasance. It also saw the construction of 200 new, but intentionally temporary buildings, canals, and lagoons. And in order to build all of this, Chicago brought in some of the generation's most influential architects and designers. In charge of the green spaces was the father of landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted. You probably know him for designing Central Park in New York. The director of works for the fair was Daniel Burnham, who designed the Flatiron Building in New York and Union Station in Washington, D.C. It was Burnham who emphasized the architecture and sculpture design of the fair, including designing the buildings in an ornate neoclassical style, and that were ultimately painted white, resulting in the fair being referred to as the White City. To help complete all of the buildings and sculptures planned for the fair, the organizers used a new technology for the time: spray paint, resulting in some critics to actually deride the structures as decorated sheds. But hey, I've seen some pretty nice sheds in my day, so that could have been a compliment. I mean, people now actually live in homes the size of sheds. So who's to critique the decorated ones? Aside from the white color painted on most of the buildings, the fair also received its moniker from the prevalence of electricity and the 93,000 incandescent lamps which lit the streets after dark. The Westinghouse Corporation won the bid for illuminating the fair, after they outbid Edison, making it the first all-electric fair in history. If the sheer number of incandescent lights seems astounding to you, that's because it is. The Columbian Exposition actually consumed 3 times as much electricity as the city of Chicago itself. In the words of Eric Larson, author of The Devil in the White City, these were important engineering milestones. But what visitors adored was the sheer beauty of seeing so many lights ignited in one place, at one time. Every building, including the manufacturers and liberal arts building, was outlined in white bulbs. Giant searchlights, the largest ever made, and said to be visible 60 miles away, had been mounted on the manufacturer's roof and swept the grounds and surrounding neighborhoods. Large colored bulbs lit the 100-foot plumes of water that burst from the McMonnies fountain. It was like getting a sudden vision of heaven. All in all, the fair saw 27 million visitors in its 6-month runtime, which began on May 1st of 1893 when then-President Grover Cleveland pushed a button to light up all 93,000 lamps, and then closed in October. 46 nations participated in the fair, and it was the first fair to have national pavilions, with each nation choosing a representative to host their pavilion. In charge of organizing all of the exhibits was Director General George R. Davis. Some of the groundbreaking attractions at the fair included the world's first Ferris Wheel, the first publicly accessible moving walkway, designed by Joseph Silsby, which took patrons along the lake to the casino, life-sized replicas of Christopher Columbus's ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria.
The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria.
There was also a replica of the Gokstad ship, the Viking, which Norway gave to the fair to keep. It now resides in Geneva, Illinois, home of the Geneva High School Vikings. Edward Muybridge gave a series of lectures on the science of animal locomotion in the Zoopraxographical Hall, built specifically for that purpose on Midway Plaisance. He used his zoopraxiscope to show his moving pictures to a paying public. The hall was the first commercial movie theater. A section of the fair called The Street in Cairo gave us the world-renowned Hoochie Coochie song, which I guarantee you is not what you're thinking. Today, it's commonly referred to as the Snake Charmer song. Other staples that were introduced at the fair include juicy fruit gum, cream of wheat, Cracker Jacks, shredded wheat cereal, and Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, among many others. A notable snub from the fair was Buffalo Bill Cody, who decided to nevertheless come to Chicago during the fair and set up his famous Buffalo Bill's Wild West show just outside the gates.
I started blasting. Bang! Bang! Well, I don't see so good, so I missed. Then they ran away. I ran after them.
Okay.
Bang! Tried to shoot him in the back. But I don't want so good either. Anyway.
It wasn't all great at the fair, however, as violence and murder was prevalent all throughout its run. One notorious story is that of Herman Webster Mudgett, also known to many through the book The Devil in the White City as Dr. H.H. Holmes, the U.S.'s first serial killer, who allegedly murdered rampantly throughout the Exposition's run. And a person who Hollywood still owes us a Leonardo DiCaprio adaptation of. I just want to see the movie. Now, I say allegedly murdered these people at the World's Fair because despite confessing to 27 different murders, some of the people he claimed to have murdered were in fact still alive. What isn't up for debate is that he did murder people, which is bad. People just have different totals on how many people he actually murdered. H.H. Holmes came to Chicago in 1886, where he got a job in a drugstore. A few years later, he purchased land and began building a 2-story mixed-use building in which one of Mr. Holmes's creditors died before completion. He then added a 3rd floor in 1892, telling his investors he intended to use it as a hotel during the 1893 World's Fair. It's said that this hotel had a series of secret rooms and hidden passageways, which Holmes would use to sneak unseen to murder unsuspecting guests. Ultimately, after confessing, Holmes was hanged in 1896. A less famous story, but still nonetheless shocking, was the assassination of Chicago's mayor, Carter Harrison Sr., 2 days before the closing of the fair. The closing ceremonies of the fair were actually canceled in favor of a public memorial service. Initially, after the fair was over, there was a movement to refinish the temporary facades and exteriors with more permanent marble, so that guests could experience the beauty for years to come. Ultimately, these plans were canceled when, in July of 1894, a fire broke out and destroyed much of the fairgrounds. The only 2 buildings that remain today from the World Columbian Exposition are the Palace of Fine Arts, which actually was rebuilt with more permanent materials and now houses the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. So this building's a real Ship of Theseus conundrum.
You are familiar with the thought experiment, the Ship of Theseus, in the field of identity metaphysics.
The other building is the World's Congress Auxiliary Building, which wasn't even built in Jackson Park, but is the home of the current Art Institute of Chicago. The 1893 World's Fair is often credited with growing the popularity of the City Beautiful movement, and is seen as the basis for most modern city planning. It showed what was possible when planners, landscape architects, and architects worked together on a comprehensive design scheme. The White City inspired other cities to focus on the beautification of the components of the city in which municipal government had control: streets, municipal art, public buildings, and public spaces. The success of the fair also led the Merchants Club of Chicago to commission the fair's director of works, Daniel Burnham, to create the Plan of Chicago in 1909. This plan ultimately helped reshape Chicago's central area throughout the 20th century. And that's the 1893 World's Fair. While it didn't last long, it certainly left its mark on urban planning, societal constructs, Chicago itself, and utopian idealism. If you made it this far into the video, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the world's Columbian Exposition. Leave them in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, as it helps the channel grow and helps more people get exposed to these videos and utopias. And always remember that the future is out there.